Modern music production gives an artist infinite tracks, perfect digital pitch correction, and software that can mix a record while they sleep. It is a marvel of convenience. But if you walk into a top-tier studio today and ask the producer to recreate the exact sonic depth of a classic rock staple, they will tell you the truth. They can't do it. The greatest tracks in rock history weren't made by clicking a mouse. They were forged through physical manipulation, custom-built basement electronics, and raw, unquantized human chemistry. When there was no digital safety net, musicians had to bleed for their sound. Today, we are uncovering the analog secrets and the very real studio struggles behind 10 tracks that permanently changed music. These are the records that forced engineers to invent entirely new ways of capturing sound. They created sonic fingerprints so distinctly tied to their moment in time that they remain completely impossible to copy. 10. Sultans of Swing by Dire Straits. There are guitar solos you recognize in 2 notes. Mark Knopfler's pristine rolling tone on Dire Straits' 1978 hit is one of them. Here's what most people don't realize. That immaculate sound wasn't meticulously planned out over weeks of studio tweaking. It was the result of a tight budget and a borrowed amplifier left sitting in a corner. The band was practically broke when they walked into Pathway Studios in London. They were paying for their recording time entirely out of pocket, which meant the clock was ticking louder than the metronome. Knopfler was struggling to capture the crisp sound he wanted out of his 1961 Fender Stratocaster. The standard gear just wasn't delivering the clarity he heard in his head. Out of frustration, he plugged into a Roland Jazz Chorus amp that someone else had abandoned in the room. He locked his guitar's 5-way pickup selector switch into the out-of-phase middle position. Then, knowing they couldn't afford a dozen takes, he ditched his guitar pick altogether. He relied purely on his fingers. He tracked that complex, winding final solo in just 1 take. The result was a hollow, perfectly clean tone that cut directly through the heavy, distorted aggression of the post-punk radio landscape. It proved that virtuosic, jazz-inflected musicianship still had a firm place on the American FM dial. Sometimes the tightest constraints forced the most enduring art. 9. Money by Pink Floyd. When you hear the rhythmic churn of cash registers and tearing paper that opens Pink Floyd's 1973 hit, it sounds like an early digital sampler at work. But in the early 70s, there was no button to push to make that happen. That entire rhythmic introduction was literally taped together on a studio floor, using a physical ruler. Roger Waters created the loop by cutting and splicing pieces of magnetic audio tape by hand. It was a tedious, unforgiving process. Drummer Nick Mason spent hours crawling on the cold floor of Abbey Road Studios, painstakingly measuring the exact lengths of tape to ensure the rhythmic loop kept perfect time. This all happened before the band ever picked up their actual instruments to record, and the ambition didn't stop there. The song was written in a punishing 7/4 time signature. That was a structural choice, almost unheard of for a radio-friendly track. It shifted into a standard 4/4 rhythm only when it was time for the searing guitar solo. People pulled their cars over to listen to something that sounded so entirely alien. Think about that for a second. Pink Floyd built a massive commercial success using avant-garde studio manipulation that required actual scissors and sticky tape. It is a testament to what happens when musicians treat the recording console as a physical instrument rather than just a machine. 8. I'm Not in Love by 10 Cubic Centimeters. sometimes an arrangement just refuses to work. The British band 10 Cubic Centimeters was ready to abandon their 1975 ballad entirely after weeks of failing to find the right backing instruments. It sounded flat. It lacked emotion. Then Kevin Godley suggested something radical. He wanted to strip away the guitars and drums and replace them entirely with human voices. The ethereal, sweeping synthesizer sound you hear carrying the track isn't a keyboard at all. I'm not alone. It is 256 human voices manually mixed on a massive analog console. The band spent 3 solid weeks in Strawberry Studios just recording themselves singing single, sustained notes. They then constructed physical tape loops of these notes. These weren't small loops. They were 12 feet long. I'm not alone. They stretched across the control room, running continuously through the tape machines and wrapping around microphone stands to keep tension. The engineers used the mixing desk faders like keys on a piano, riding the volume up and down to actually play the vocal chords as the song progressed.
Boys don't cry. Big boys don't cry.
To achieve the sheer density of the sound, the track required a grueling 256 separate vocal overdubs onto a 16-track recorder. They pushed the absolute limits of analog tape bouncing. If they had recorded over the same tape even a few more times, the magnetic oxide would have degraded completely. It would have erased weeks of work. They risked destroying the song to make it perfect. And that gamble resulted in a haunting atmospheric soundscape that modern digital samplers still struggle to organically replicate. Real magic usually happens just before everything falls apart. 7. When the Levee Breaks by Led Zeppelin. Mama, you got to move. Pushing the boundaries of the studio console was one way to find a new sound, but sometimes the physical building itself held the secret. The heaviest, most sampled drum groove in rock history was captured entirely by accident in a cold, echoing hallway. In 1971, Led Zeppelin was working at the Headley Grange estate. It was an old, drafty stone building, and space was tight. Engineer Andy Johns just needed to get John Bonham's massive Ludwig drum kit out of the way for a bit, so he stuck it at the bottom of a 3-story stone stairwell. But when Bonham started to warm up, the sound bouncing off those hard, reflective walls was staggering. Johns immediately hung 2 Beyer Dynamic M160 microphones up on the second floor to capture the natural reverberation of the space. He ran that signal through a Binson Ecorec delay unit to give it a strange, rhythmic tail. During the mixing process, the track was heavily compressed and physically slowed down. That specific combination birthed a thick, sludgy groove that hits you right in the chest. Hip-hop producers have spent decades sampling it, trying to harness that exact weight. But they can never quite recreate the raw physics of that specific afternoon. It redefined how rock drums were recorded forever. Producers stopped cramming kits into tight, deadened isolation booths. They realized that the room itself was a member of the band. 6. More Than a Feeling by Boston. While some bands relied on historic mansions to capture their tone, others had to build their cathedrals underground. The defining, stadium-sized rock sound of 1976 was engineered by an MIT graduate in his basement, completely dodging the scrutiny of a major record label. Tom Scholz spent years financing his own analog equipment using his salary from Polaroid. He built a studio beneath his Massachusetts home and practically invented his own guitar effects from scratch. And he worked alone. When Epic Records signed his band, They demanded a professional studio recording. They certainly didn't want a basement tape. So, Scholes faked it. He traveled to Los Angeles and recorded a few acoustic tracks just to keep the executives happy. Meanwhile, he secretly snuck his own basement master tapes onto the final record. To get that overwhelming sonic footprint, Schultz heavily relied on 32-track analog bouncing. He layered harmony upon harmony, creating a dense, multi-tracked orchestral guitar tone that sounded like 10 musicians playing at once. It was impossibly pristine. It bridged the gap between heavy hard rock and soaring pop melody in a way that set a terrifyingly high standard for audio engineering. Sometimes, the only way to realize your vision is to lock the door and hide it from the people paying the bills. 5. Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys. But what happens when you don't hide from the label and instead spend their money with absolute, obsessive abandon? This 3.5-minute song took more studio time and capital to create than most rock bands spent on their entire discographies. In 1966, Brian Wilson was chasing a sound he couldn't quite articulate.
She's somehow closer now.
He spent over $50,000, roughly $500,000 today, jumping between 4 different Hollywood studios. He wasn't just recording a band. He was trying to capture the specific acoustic characteristics of 4 different rooms. Wilson recorded nearly 90 hours of tape over a grueling 7-month period. He obsessively spliced together disjointed, short musical fragments with a razor blade, building the final composition second by second. This modular approach to song construction was totally unheard of. Then, he brought in Paul Tanner to play the electro-theremin. It introduced an eerie sci-fi electronic tone to mainstream pop radio that audiences had never experienced before. The sheer scale of the production changed everything. It revolutionized the concept of the recording studio, proving it wasn't just a room to document a live performance. The studio itself was a distinct musical instrument, capable of building symphonies that could never be played on a stage. 4. Tom Sawyer by Rush.
Catch the myth, catch the mystery, catch the myth.
Even when synthesizers started to become a staple of rock, the most defining tones often came from sheer luck. The signature, futuristic growl that opens Rush's 1981 hit was discovered entirely by accident during a routine sound check. The band was recording at Les Studio in Quebec, surrounded by freezing Canadian winter temperatures. They were in the middle of a brutal writing process, struggling to meld their heavy progressive rock roots with the emerging new wave digital sounds of the early 80s. Geddy Lee was simply tweaking the knobs on his Oberheim OBX synthesizer to test the levels.
Mean stride, today's Tom Sawyer, mean pride.
Suddenly, he stumbled upon a fat, sweeping filter sound. It vibrated the floorboards. That accidental tone became the structural backbone of the entire song. And that's where everything changes. They took that synthetic foundation and layered it with punishing rhythmic math. The song alternates rapidly between a standard 4/4 and an odd 7/8 time signature. It features a drum solo by Neil Peart that is so complex it still challenges top-tier professionals today. Yet, it dominated American FM radio. It proved that extreme technical virtuosity and confusing time signatures didn't have to alienate listeners. When anchored by the right sound, pure complexity can become a radio anthem.
3.
Baba O'Reilly by The Who. Rush found magic in a brand new synthesizer. But a full decade earlier, the marriage of heavy rock and precise electronics was born not from a futuristic machine, but from a piece of living room furniture, the pulsing, hypnotic introduction to The Who's 1971 anthem sounds like a modern digital sequence. It isn't. That is Pete Townshend playing a Lowrey Berkshire Deluxe TB-01 home organ. And here's the strange part. Townshend actually mathematically programmed the vital statistics of his spiritual guru, Meher Baba, into the organ using its marimba repeat function. He then took that signal and fed it through an EMS VCS3 synthesizer to filter and shape the sound. This created a relentless backing track. When the band went into the studio, they couldn't just play freely. They had to manually lock their live instruments into that rigid mechanical pulse, listening hard through their headphones and fighting the natural human urge to speed up or slow down. This pioneered the use of a sequenced backing track in a hard rock context, completely altering the rhythmic foundation of the genre. They successfully married raw, destructive power chords with cold, mechanical precision. When you force wild human energy to lock in with a machine, you create a tension that never fully resolves. 2. Aja by Steely Dan. While Townshend embraced the machine, others demanded that humans play with the exactitude of one. Steely Dan ruthlessly fired some of the most respected studio musicians in America during the 1977 sessions for this album. Their playing simply wasn't perfect enough. Donald Fagen and Walter Becker were uncompromising. They heavily churned through the industry's elite session players just to capture the exact groove they heard in their heads. For the sprawling 8-minute title track, they finally brought in jazz drum master Steve Gadd. He sat down, sight-read the incredibly complex chart, and miraculously nailed his chaotic explosive drum solo in just 2 takes. The track features some of the most pristine, high-fidelity analog recording ever achieved. It eventually won a Grammy for its pristine engineering. It stands as the defining pinnacle of studio craft in the 70s. You can edit a track to death on a modern computer, but you cannot artificially generate the sweat and instinct of a master playing at the absolute peak of their powers. 1. Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen. We've talked about tight budgets and strict perfectionism, but this final track is a story of pure obsession. The tape used to record the operatic section of Queen's 1975 masterwork literally became transparent because it was run over the recording heads so many times. Freddie Mercury had written the entire complex arrangement in his head. He famously directed the band through the vocal sections using scraps of paper torn from a telephone directory. They locked themselves away at Rockfield Studios for 3 weeks. They bounced down 190/80 separate vocal overdubs onto a standard 24-track analog tape machine. They recorded over the same piece of tape so frequently that the physical magnetic oxide coating began to wear off. The engineers could actually see light shining through the tape as it passed over the metal heads. They were one pass away from erasing the entire song. Clocking in at 5 minutes and 55 seconds, the finished track defied every established rule of commercial radio formatting. It lacked a traditional pop chorus entirely, yet it forced DJs to play a marathon song, proving that audiences were starving for complex, genre-defying composition on the mainstream dial. They pushed the physical medium of recording until it literally started to vanish. We look back at these analog masterworks not just with nostalgia, but with genuine awe for the human ingenuity required to capture them. Without digital safety nets, these musicians relied purely on instinct, invention, and a willingness to push magnetic tape to its absolute breaking point. Their struggle birthed sonic landscapes that algorithms still cannot replicate, because some songs become hits, but others define an entire moment.